And I am joined on the phone line. He still sits atop the morning show guest power rankings. He is New York Times best-selling author Peter Schweizer. Hi, Peter.
Hey, great to be with you, Preston, as always. Thanks so much.
We've known each other for a while now. There've been a few books, and your books tend to have this interconnection. Seemingly, they just seem to always have some commonalities in the players and how these sort of ominous events take place. Take me back to where the idea came from that there needed to be a book devoted to what's going on in China that you've entitled Blood Money: Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. Where'd this all begin?
Well, it really began in noticing that corruption's become globalized in America. I mean, we're all used to, the politician who's trying to get a federal paving contract for his nephew or something like that, or the politician who's taken $100,000 in money from in a shoebox from a lobbyist. That's kind of the corruption we're used to. That's bad enough. But what's really happened over the last decade is corruption in America has become globalized. You find these politicians, both sides of the aisle, who find, foreign oligarchs, foreign governments that are willing to stuff money in their pockets. Now, they do it kind of in a more subtle way than a shoebox. They'll set up a family member in a quote-unquote private equity deal that's funded by, a foreign government. But I wanted to look at this nexus, and this book, I think, is a little bit different in the others that, before the problem concern was always the corruption. In this particular case, I really wanted to look at the things that China has done over the last 5-6 years that has killed literally millions of Americans, and the fact that we're getting very little attention paid to it by positions of authority. I mean, in other words, this is corruption that actually is a life and death issue and has affected the United States dramatically in so many ways.
You say you really focused in for the last 5 or 6 years. If I were to try to maybe kind of look at this as a plant, all right, that's the growth above the ground. Where do the roots of this thing begin? Does it start with, capitalism trying to find a way into China and us embracing that?
Yeah, I mean, that was the origin, right? The idea was great, and it was one that I embraced for a long time. The idea was, China is a developing world country, going back in the 80s. And look, if we encourage them towards free markets and capitalism, they're going to become more like us. They're going to become more liberal. And for a while, people thought that's the way things were going to go. And that abruptly ended with the rise of President Xi. More than a decade ago. And so what you have is in China is you don't have a market economy. You don't have a Marxist economy. You have what I call a market-Leninist economy. So you have certain elements of capitalism, but you have the Leninist, communist control system. And the allure of China, you look around the world, if you're a Wall Street investor or you're a Silicon Valley entrepreneur, the lure of, the world's most populous country, growing rapidly, the prospects of making enormous sums of money is enormous. And their ability to, tap into politicians' family members as a lure is powerful and has been quite effective. And so that's kind of the origins and the headwaters of it. What you have going on at the same time, though, Preston, is really a concerted effort in China, what they call disintegration warfare. And that's something that was written about in 2010. They've embraced it. And really what it is, Preston, is, their view that they are at war with the United States, but it's not a war with tanks. It's not a war with aircraft carriers. But it is a war with casualties. And it's based on the idea of what can we do to disintegrate, fragment, American society in a way that would allow us to beat them without actually getting into a kinetic fighting war. And that's what we're seeing unfolding, whether it's fentanyl, whether it's COVID, whether it's violence in American streets, whether it's a lot of the social division that we're facing in the country today. They didn't cause it, but they are absolutely fanning the flames in a very, very aggressive way, and our leaders don't want to talk about it.
Peter Schweizer with us. The book is Blood Money, subtitled Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. We're going to get to that with a little more detail. Peter, for the benefit of our listeners and for me, broadly set up, who are the main players in this particular story?
So the main players on the side of China is President Xi. And I think what people are going to get is a different look at President Xi than they've previously heard. Part of it is understanding who this man is and what his motives are. He really reveres his father, who was a CCP leader, and he built a mausoleum. His father's perhaps most famous act was as a young man at the age of 14. Xi's father tried to poison his teacher because the teacher was not sufficiently revolutionary. And Xi thinks that was a bold, courageous act. So I think that offers insight into kind of his view and perspective. The other thing to understand about Xi is that his wife is a very famous singer in China. In fact, she's so famous, I would say even infamous, because after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, she was brought in to serenade the troops who had just massacred people on the square. So this is a hardened, tough man who has a very different view than we do. On our side, it's a series of people. It includes President Biden. It includes Republican leader Mitch McConnell. It includes people like Governor Gavin Newsom, who have entanglements with Chinese entities, not even with Chinese entities, but in some cases they're brushing up against Chinese organized crime networks that are actually involved in things like the fentanyl trade. So it is a mosaic that includes characters on both sides of the aisle, and it's I think, really the story of what America is facing today, because when you look at a lot of the challenges that we are facing in this country, social division, violence in our streets, a lot of this is the flames are being fanned by China. They didn't cause it, but they're absolutely exaggerating it because they are seeing the strategic benefits of doing so.
Peter, in the news just this week, we talked about an arrest in Georgia, 4 nationals, one at least here illegally, involved in what they believe is an potentially international marijuana grow farm. We're also seeing that 90% of the illegals coming in across the border in San Diego are China. They're coming from China. This is all connected to your story, correct?
That's exactly right, Preston. I've got a section in the book. It's about the drug warfare that China's engaged in. They are the senior partner in the fentanyl trade. The Mexican cartels are the junior partner. But also, to your point, this problem with illegal marijuana grows in the United States is massive. In the state of Maine alone, there are 300 known large-scale marijuana growing operations that are run by Chinese nationals, many of which have come into the country illegally. These are financed with money from China. And what they're doing, Preston, is they're not producing the marijuana, in the 1990s that kids were smoking in college. This stuff is highly, highly potent, much more potent than the stuff sold legally. It can be laced with fentanyl, of course. And this is part of what China calls explicitly cognitive warfare. They want to certainly profit from this, but they also want to sort of dumb down, destabilize, and soften American culture. So when people wonder why people are, Chinese nationals are crossing the border in Mexico, I would argue a big part of it is they have a large need for labor. These illegal marijuana grows are in Maine, they're in Oklahoma, they're in Washington State, they're in California, they're all over the place.
WFLA on your phone with the iHeartRadio app and on hundreds of devices like Alexa, Google Home, Xbox, and Sonos.
And free.
And iHeart's radio station.
22 past. When I say he sits atop the guest power rankings, it doesn't offend any other guest that I ever have on the show, because anybody who ever sits and listens to Peter Schweizer, who's read his books, they just step back and go, yeah, he's right. He's amazing. The research, the amount of work that goes into one of these books, and the book is Blood Money. And Peter, you said something previously, and I'd read this as well, that China thinks it can win the war literally and take this nation without firing many bullets. It needs to for infrastructure, for all kinds of reasons. But is that where TikTok comes in, the ability to analyze what Americans are digesting, consuming, and are moved by?
Oh, absolutely. I've got a whole section in the book on TikTok. And what I would say, Preston, is, don't take my word for what TikTok is doing. Take the words of the Chinese officials and military officers I quote in the book. We got access to documents from the Chinese military, military journals, et cetera, from the Chinese Ministry of Propaganda. And they're very explicit. I mean, they say explicitly that TikTok is a Trojan horse, and they dissect and they explain, I quote from them extensively, as to how they are using it to grind down America's youth, creating sort of this dopamine loop where, they need this constant urgent hit by watching these short videos, and that the video content is very dumbed down, but it's also injected with propaganda, and they lay out explicitly how they do it. The purpose is not to be explicit. You're not going to have placards of Chairman Mao, marching down in videos. But what you are going to get is videos that are designed, in their words, to strip America's young people of their understanding of their historical past, to strip them of reverence for their national symbols, because by doing so, they are then able to deconstruct America's youth and build them up in the image that they want them in. Look, TikTok is run by ByteDance, the parent company. The senior leadership there is all populated with people that work at the Ministry of State Security or used to, or at the Ministry of Propaganda, senior officials in the Chinese Communist Party. And ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, has a joint venture with the Chinese Ministry of State Security to study artificial intelligence and how it can be used to manipulate people online. This is the company that people are allowing their children unfettered access to. I mean, it's just remarkable. And the reason not much is being done in Washington, as I lay out both Republicans and Democrats, and I name names, is because there is so much money being made by certain American investors that they are hiring an army of people in D.C., former senators and congressmen, former campaign officials for Barack Obama and Donald Trump, and they're doling that money around to prevent, any serious action being taken.
Okay. Is that genie permanently out of the bottle, or are there enough people in Congress, enough people running states that can take action and do something about it?
Great question. There are some people that I think have been very, very good on TikTok, both Republicans and Democrats. Of course, people like Marco Rubio, Rick Scott have been very good on TikTok. On the Democrat side, Senator Mark Warner of Virginia has been very, very vigilant on TikTok. And the solution in my mind is, I don't know that you can ban it in the sense that something else can just emerge that's similar, but I do feel that, Trump's solution in 2020, which was to force the sale to an American company, while not ideal, because I got problems with American big tech companies too.
Sure.
You're in a whole lot better case where you can regulate and try to control a Microsoft than you can a company that is owned by basically the Chinese state. So that was the right solution. Of course, Joe Biden rescinded that. One of the reasons is that some of his biggest supporters at the Carlyle Group are major investors in TikTok. And at the same time, on the Republican side, there's a gentleman named Jeff Yass. He's a big funder for Club for Growth and Republican politicians. He is persuading some Republicans to take a hands-off approach to TikTok. So there are some very, very good people, but the battle's there, and we need to convince our elected officials that this matters to us. This matters to us because this is about the future of our country and our future generations.
Welcome to MAD Radio Network. Make a Difference Radio Network. And this is The Morning Show with Preston Scott.
Why do the powerful turn a blind eye while China kills Americans? It's called blood money. The author of the book is with us for two more segments, Peter Schweizer. Peter, you mentioned former President Trump, who many hope will be future President Trump. You mentioned the current, I won't call him president, I call him resident of the United States, Joe Biden. I have long believed that any tough talk coming from the Biden administration relating to China is saber-rattling. That when it's all said and done, he can't do anything against China because China has all the dirt necessary to absolutely overturn Biden and probably the entire administration. I feel the same way about Ukraine. Is there anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. In fact, the Chinese have a phrase they use for leaders in the West that they've co-opted with money, financial ties. And the phrase is big help with a little bad mouth. And what it means is what it sounds like. As long as you are delivering what really matters to them, and what really matters to China is unfettered access to our markets, unfettered access to our capital markets, minimal interference as they sort of continue to rise against the United States. If you want to, talk tough on Taiwan, if you want to mention human rights, they're completely fine with that because they know you have to realistically, to be viable, you have to have tough talk. And in the case of the Bidens, it's really, really clear why he will not talk tough on issues. I mean, take the issue of fentanyl. China is involved in every stage of the fentanyl production that is poisoning Americans. It's now the leading cause of death for Americans under the age of 45. Here's the problem for Joe Biden. If he calls out China, they are then going to be able to pull levers. And what is that lever? Well, the Chinese gang leader who created the fentanyl crisis in America is a guy named White Wolf. He's the head of a gang called UBG. They made the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico the kings of fentanyl. Everybody acknowledges that in Mexico. Here's the problem for the Bidens. In 2017, White Wolf's business partner gave the Biden family a $5 million interest-free forgivable loan that the Bidens have never repaid. So you literally have, Preston, 1 degree of separation between the kings of fentanyl trade and the Biden family. So does Joe Biden really want to call out China and say China is poisoning Americans? We need to stop this. We need to confront them. We need to do something about it. No, he can't. It's deeply embarrassing. And that's just one of the entanglements that he has that I think prevents him from taking any strong action on this vital issue.
What about Donald Trump? From my chair, it looked like we were starting to gain ground in our covert battle with China in his 4 years. Were we gaining ground? Is China really have anything on Trump at all?
I don't think they have anything on Trump in that sense. I think, Trump did do a lot to sort of reorient our relationship with China. I think the challenge that he faced was sort of self-created, and that is that Donald Trump, I think, has obviously supreme confidence in his power of persuasion, his ability to get people to do things. And so in 2018, he met with President Xi, and to his credit, first American president, only American president so far, who confronted China on the issue of fentanyl. President Xi told him, okay, we'll stop it. We'll ban it. We'll prevent it from being produced. We won't be involved anymore. And President Trump took him at his word and sang his praises. That's not really the way China works. You've got to be tough. You've got to be consistently tough. I do think that Trump has learned the lesson from that. I think also during COVID, I have a section in the book on COVID, on how China maximized our body counts. Part of the way that they did it, Preston, was they knew what the virus was, they knew where it was going, and they cornered the market on masks and medical supplies. Mm-hmm. So when the virus hit us, we lost a lot of medical personnel because they didn't have access to any of that equipment. Donald Trump saw that and was put in a difficult situation. And he told people in his administration, we can't talk too tough to China right now because they will withhold more equipment from us. The point being is I think Trump has learned those lessons. But it's about who he puts around him. Who are his advisors? That's going to be the real question if he becomes president again.
Always looking for the truth. It's The Morning Show with Preston Scott on News Radio 100.7 WFLA.
I don't know if he and his team will ever get a Congressional Medal of Honor for trying to save this nation, but they ought to, especially Peter Schweizer, the author, Blood Money. Peter, I want to take a second. I want to focus on the subtitle, Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. And that is a literal statement you're making there in that book that we've discussed. When we talk about the powerful, I mean, we've got the NBA, we've got the clothing and tennis shoe manufacturers. But as we talked about this week, we've got all kinds of other businesses. Boeing. How in the world does our government allow a defense contractor to be farming out work in China for our jet fighters, our strategic ammunition? I mean, I don't get it.
Yeah, well, you don't get it because you're thinking logically. You're thinking in terms of what makes practical sense for our country. How dare you, Preston? No, I mean, the problem is, again, money. Boeing wants access to the Chinese market, and this is something companies have done for decades, and they always, pardon my language, always get screwed. They always get screwed, but they think it's going to be different for them. If they, do certain deals in China, if they move manufacturing there, China's going to open up and give them access. What they always do is they end up stealing the practices and technologies and building their own version of the same product that the American company was creating. But, a lot of these companies they're thinking about the next quarter. They're thinking about their stock valuations. So they move in this direction, and it's an enormous problem. And China recognizes this dependence. So, we were talking about President Trump earlier. When Trump imposed tariffs on China as president in 2017, what did China do? Did they go to Washington, D.C. and lobby the White House? No, they didn't. They went to Silicon Valley and they went to Wall Street and said, you are going to go lobby on our behalf, because if you don't, you're not going to get certain deals in our country. And lo and behold, the big investment firms in Washington and the big tech firms in Silicon Valley all went to Washington and, pulled arms and twisted arms to lobby on behalf of the Chinese government to get rid of tariffs. And that's how they operate. And until we refuse to do that, that is going to be their approach, and it's going to be to our detriment in the future of our country.
We have to have a pretty sophisticated plan if we go that route. I mean, we have to be empowering the Pacific Rim nations that surround China. We have to secure the rare metals that are used in our F-35 from someone other than China. We can't let China have the corner on the market on those rare metals. I mean, the list goes on and on. But included in the powerful turning a blind eye, Peter, as uncomfortable as this may be, does this include us? The consumers, the people that just live in America?
It does. It does. I would encourage everybody to do something I did, and I was kind of shocked. I looked at my retirement portfolio. It's nothing fancy. You've got some, different mutual funds. I use Fidelity. But go through and look where your mutual funds are actually investing, and you will be shocked at how many of the global or world funds are invested in Chinese companies. Not just Chinese companies, Preston, but companies that are actually part of the Chinese military-industrial complex. Wow. So there are very practical things you can do. And so what I did was I sold those investment funds and said, no, I'm going to focus on, the S&P 500 index or something else. Pick another investment fund. That's the first thing. Second thing is the consumer choices you make. You can find Chinese products that are always going to be cheaper than American products, but chances are that Chinese product is made by a company that is part of a conglomerate that is wedded to the CCP and is also part of the Chinese military-industrial complex. So you are aiding and abetting, I would argue, our chief adversary when you are making a consumer choice. I understand it. The cost of things are more expensive, but just realize the implications of what you're doing when you make that choice.
Peter, I could spend a day talking with you, and you know that all too well. Thank you for your time this morning, and we'll talk again soon.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Preston.
The movie, Maybe it'll be a movie. The book is Blood Money. Why the Powerful Turn a Blind Eye While China Kills Americans. The author is Peter Schweizer. It's a HarperCollins book. You can find it literally everywhere. I joked with him. I said, you get entrees to Democrats because your book's available at Target? You can go buy it at Target. But it's literally available everywhere. He's a bestseller. And now you know why he's on top of the power rankings for Guests of the Morning Show with Preston Scott.